And the
Recording is
kind of,
on.
what was that? Okay. So the kind of concept that I'm playing with here is that of regenerative labor. That's what I put in my talk, or that's what I put in the pitch in the abstract. A lot of these words kind of jump around each other. There's care work, there's reproductive labor, there's maintenance. And like these concepts are all have a lot in common. And so at the end of the day, you just have to kind of pick your language and stick with it. And so when I talk about regenerative labor, and specifically when I talk about chores, it's the sort of repetitive and low status work that maintains equilibrium. It needs to be done, or else the group kind of really starts to struggle. Everyone needs it to be done, but it's often undersupplied because the benefits everyone gets the benefits of a clean kitchen, but the person who actually does the cleaning takes on all of the cost. And so thinking about how we kind of organize and structure this is like an important decision, an important organizational and social decision. And kind of the specific sort of operationalization that I came up with was, regenerative labor maintains physical capital, it maintains physical space, but it also creates social capital, right? Like you're doing something physical to maintain your environment, but the process of doing it actually creates something else, social capital. So it's not zero sum, and that's kind of why I think it's interesting, and why I think this framing is distinct from care work, which is more about relationships, reproductive labor, which has like a feminist, anti-capitalist sort of frame, which is not exactly the framing that I want to sort of be in. And then maintenance is more about just like physical things only. So that's kind of the language I'm going to be using. And this isn't a new idea that the sort of like maintenance, regenerative labor is like undervalued. There was an artist, Mirle Lederman Ukeles, in the 60s and 70s, who talked exactly about this. She said that there were two systems. Development was the sort of new and exciting, I'm making art, I'm like, leading the organization, this is like the exciting new work that I want to do. It's high status, it's incentivized because I get benefits, either money, or I get status in the group, and I want to do that. And then maintenance, which is her language, is just keeping. Yeah, she says keep the dust off of the individual stuff. Cleaning and like physical organizing, and that was her thing. And so this is a photo of her just dumping the water off of a mop bucket, and this is like a piece of artwork. And so she developed a whole career around maintenance art. She actually, funnily enough, she lives in New York City, and she spent, I think she's still alive. She was for 40 years a member of the New York Department of Sanitation as their artist in residence, which is like pretty cool when you think about it. Yes, this idea of there's like the high status work that everyone's excited about, and the low status work that people don't want to do, and that thinking about how to integrate the low status work is a really important part of keeping any group functioning. And so to kind of talk about why this sort of special case of regenerative labor is interesting from a new institutions perspective. Like, okay, so we agree that maintenance, regenerative labor is important. We should all be doing more of it. But then, how do we get to we can actually design new institutions, new structures specifically around making this happen, right? And so I studied math in graduate school, and so something that we learned was you'll often hear there's a general case, general relativity. There's a special case, special relativity. And what is the difference? So, a special case of a problem has some kind of additional structure, some kind of additional constraint that isn't true in the general case. And the special case is what allows some kind of solution that leverages that special structure that isn't really true always, right? So the special case has a special structure that allows for a solution. And so in this case, when I talk about regenerative labor, that special structure is repetition, right? When we talk about work generally, right, work has no special structure. It's just things need to be done and people do them. And so there's not a lot you can do to structure that, because it's just you can't structure anything anytime. That's just you have to just take it as it comes. But with regenerative labor, the special structure is that it's repeating, right? It's not always a new task. it's the same task over and over again. And by really taking advantage and understanding how this special structure of repetition makes it possible to actually develop a new institutional arrangement around doing it, then we really get into, okay, how does this, how can we actually make a meaningful impact on this problem? So that's kind of the framework that I brought into this and that I want to share with you today. Um, and so we're going to kind of keep going down this designing new institutions thread, right? How do you actually design structures? And like, this was the digital tool that I developed. How do you actually go about doing this? Like, who are your influences? What are the tools that you're going to draw on? And in my case, there were two sort of theorists and academics whose work really inspired this project. There was Stafford Beer, who was a British business theorist who was one of the early pioneers of cybernetics, which is a term that I think people throw around and like, wow, it's so what computery. Very interesting what he was doing. Some people really love it, some people are very critical of it. But his whole idea was that the world is increasingly complex, and the computer is actually an essential tool for managing and organizing that complexity, right? And so for him, he thought, computers can actually either make complexity or they can reduce complexity. And he very much felt like computers should reduce complexity. And I would say he said that actually they were essential, and that without computers, we just couldn't live in this increasingly complicated world. And so he's really into how do we use the computer to simplify. And he has this quote: without a model of the system to be regulated, you cannot have a regulator. If you are unwilling to say this is the system that we are trying to live within, then you're just not going to be able to really get a handle on it. So that was Stafford. Eleanor Ostrom was an American economist who studied natural resource management. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And so she would study how groups, people who shared a forest, like, a forest in Switzerland, how the people there organized their logging so they didn't, log the entire forest. Or, in Turkey, how fishermen would organize how often people were allowed to fish in their sort of bay or harbor so they didn't overfish. And kind of her whole angle was that, a lot of her contemporaries, economists, were really into their theories, the theory of general equilibrium, the theory of this. And what made her really distinct and unique was that she actually went in and did empirical work. She didn't theorize. She went in and saw what are actual groups doing that's actually working. And then from that, she extracted a general theory. And so kind of the line that she didn't say it, but is, famously about her work is, Ostrom's law is a resource arrangement that works in practice can work in theory. We don't have to, we can take things that work and ask ourselves why they work versus say something cannot work. And so she designed these 8 principles, which are not on a slide, but are basically sort of these rules for how a group can manage shared resources. I actually probably put that on a slide, but for now we're not going to get it. But I say that because in the next slide, I'm going to talk about 4 principles that, me and, Seth Frey, who I worked with on this, and our friend Joe, who's a game designer, to develop to think about how can we design new digital institutions to help people manage these sort of shared resource problems. And so this is kind of like our approach, which we call design principles for distributed digital institutions. And the idea there was, how do you create digital tools that allow people to share power and share resources and accomplish shared goals in a way that is robust, resistant to capture, like safe, accessible to people, and really creates a relationship between the human and the technology that leads to, I would say, more agency and empowerment and less of a feeling of disempowerment and control, which is something that I have spent many years in technology, and I'm very aware of the way that the conversation often goes to a place of we don't like the technology, we feel like it's being designed by others and being imposed on us. And so something that I cared a lot about, and we cared a lot about, was how do we design a technology that is, for the people using it and not against them. And so this was kind of the framework that we designed. And I would say it's funny because we did this work in 2001 or 21, which is way before AI kind of came onto the scene. But I think as we think about what does AI governance look like and what do AI systems look like, which is not what this is about, I think a lot of these principles kind of hold up So, I think that as a way to think about designing technology systems in which humans are really centered as the agent acting and not someone to be acted upon, I think these actually hold up pretty nicely. So so that was kind of the principle. Now we're going to talk about the specific tools, the Chores app that we developed, Chore Wheel, the kind of suite of tools, the specific tools. Showers. They're free to use. You can use them with your community today. If you want to use them, you just email me and we'll set you up. This is like a live tool that real people use that you can use today. So just so everyone knows, this is not a theory. This is a real thing. And kind of my sort of proposition here around going back to regenerative labor, and like people don't do it. Like people don't do the dishes. They don't take out the trash, and this is creates a lot of frustration. And kind of my attitude, my proposition, which is I'm just going to assert this. I think that people actually want to contribute. I think that it's not that people don't want to contribute. I think that they want to contribute. They want to support each other. They just don't want to. They don't want to do it if it's going to be too hard. I think that when we think about regenerative labor, the fact that it's low status, people aren't going to go out of their way to do it. I think that they'll do it if it's easy to do. They'll do it if they get a little bit of recognition for it, but they're not going to do it otherwise. And so to really make this happen, you have to make it easy and visible. And I think kind of as I've been developing this sort of theory and thinking about what are we really doing here and why, something that I've kind of realized is that the key to making this type of regenerative labor easy to do is to separate the defining of the work from the doing of the work. That's the key mechanistic innovation, separating the chore definition from the chore performance that allows us to sort of break down and simplify the task. Going back to the special case, what is repetition is the special structure, and that special structure allows us to take a task and actually split it into two, defining it and doing it. And by doing that split, you make it so much easier and simpler for people to participate. And so that is the way that we use these sort of technology tools to really reorganize the problem in a way that makes it more easy for people to solve. And down here I have a little chart, which I know could be a little bigger, and this is what we call a Pareto curve. And the idea here is that we have kind of two axes: consistency, flexibility, and we have all these different chore systems, right? There's the paper chart, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is there's a chart on the wall. It's on Tuesday night, so and so does the dishes. On Thursday, so and so takes out the trash, and that works fine, but is ultimately pretty limited because it's not dynamic. Then you can also have something like a brag sheet where people don't have any expectations or requirements. They just do whatever they want all the time, and they post it in the Slack. And that works in some ways also. It's very popular because it's not structured, but also it's really, there's not any sense of accountability. And so when you add a digital system that is able to separate task definition from performance, you're able to get both more flexibility while also getting more consistency. And so thinking about the theory here of why these tools work, this is kind of what's happening like fundamentally at a theoretical level. And so we kind of made these specific tools. Chore Wheel is the name of the overall product set. It's three tools. There's Chores, which is organizing of regenerative labor, the actual physical work. Hearts is a tool for organizing norms and long-term accountability. And so, if we ever have to decide that someone is not right for the space, Hearts is the tool that really helps us make that decision. And so, my motivation with that one, I'm not going to talk about it so much, but I want to touch on it. I'm very deeply skeptical of communal spaces where it's like people are kicked out based on vibes. I'm a real institutionalist. I believe in systems and structure, and any sort of like, we just don't think that you're a right fit for us with no sort of like clear reasoning, I really have like a negative reaction to. And so coming up with some kind of system that both gave the flexibility to say, you're not contributing, while also I think really protecting that person from what can often feel like capricious sort of judgment, was something that really motivated me. So that system works pretty well. We had to ask one person to leave Sage, And I think in that case, the system was quite helpful. So I think it's been pretty validated. And the last tool is called Things, just for organizing shared spending of funds. And all of these three tools, going back to this sort of slide, use the same concepts, right? So all of them take these design principles and re-implement them around a specific resource management task. And the reason why I think that's kind of cool is because it shows us that this sort of set of design guidelines can actually be applied to many different domains. It's essentially each of these tools is the same design guidelines wrapped around a different resource. And that I think is actually quite interesting because all of these resources can be managed, um, and with slight variations based on the actual nature of the resource. But the way that people interact is the same. And going back to the question at the beginning, how do you get people to actually adopt new tools? I think the more that the overhead of what they have to learn is reduced, the better, right? So in this case, there's a single language for interacting with all of these tools. And so once someone learns how to use one of them, they can very easily use all of the tools. And so you really get kind of three interventions for the price of one because we have a shared kind of design language. And one thing that kind of falls out of these design principles is that every action, and the term I use is 1 degree, meaning every decision is pretty simple, right? I really wanted to break down, imagine you're at a budgeting meeting and you have to set the annual budget. And that is a single, very complex decision because every piece of the decision is interrelated. You can't just say, we're going to set aside $5,000 for, improvements. It's, well, this is our total budget and we have to then make every decision has to interlock. And so when you have a single complex decision where every piece depends on every other, that's a very hard decision to make. But if every decision can be broken down into a simple, okay, well, let's put more resources into maintenance and less into, decorating, now every decision is simplified. And so by really taking every single decision and stripping it down to its essentials, it becomes much easier to really distribute the decision making among the group versus having a single point where the decision has to go through because the decision is too complicated to be made in a distributed way by individuals. So that was another thing that I think is worth pointing out. I'll talk a bit more about the Chores app because it's kind of what everything revolves around. It's a community currency and contribution system. The way that it works, if you haven't seen me talk about it before, is that everyone owes 100 points per month, so there's not a schedule. The specific chores have a dynamic value, which is they're not a fixed value, but the longer it's been since a chore was done, the more points it's worth. So it's going back to the dishes, right? It's, dishes are worth 5 points. No one does them. The next day they're worth 10 points. No one does them. The next day they're worth 20 points. And all of a sudden now someone says, hey, 20 points, that's not bad. I'll do the dishes, right? And so without a schedule, we still get everyone contributing. We still get everything being done. And the people ultimately have more agency because it's not like, oh, it's Thursday, I have to go do my chore. I can't go to this party I wanted to go to. It's people say, okay, it's my time. I'm going to use it however I want, but I have to think, okay, if this chore, if I have some free time, if there's a chore that is, valued that I want to do, I'll go do it, right? So we get the same outcome, but with much less restrictive control, and with much more freedom and autonomy, which is something that obviously is very important to me. So anyone can do a chore, anyone can prioritize a chore, and what that means is that not every chore is equally important. And being able to say, I think we should be doing more. I think we need to do more trash takeout. Or I actually want us to put more time into gardening, or I want us to do more, of stocking the pantry. You can do that, and then that way, you can sort of guide the system such that the outcomes that you care about are being prioritized or are occurring more often. Again, without a single big meeting where we say, okay, we have to decide how every single chore is valued for the entire year, right? There's none of that. There's individual people saying, okay, I want to make a small marginal change in this direction. And then over time, those decisions compound into a sort of a prioritization that really meets everyone's needs. And it kind of emerges, decisions emerge bottom up. There's not a manager who's sort of deciding this for the group. Everything is emergent based on these, what I called 1 degree decisions. And the last thing is that, when someone does a chore, the claim goes into the Slack channel, right? We can see it right here. And everyone else gives it the upvote. So that kind of visibility that I said people wanted is really built in, right? People are, doing the dishes, they're taking out the trash, but they're not just doing it and then feeling resentful, because it's immediately everyone can see the contribution. And I'm going to kind of anticipate the conclusion, which is, regenerative labor creates social capital because people actually are seeing the people in their lives contributing to their sort of shared flourishing. And that actually makes the relationship stronger while it also maintains the physical space. So that's kind of the unlock here, is that it's not just maintenance, something is actually being created as well. So that's that. Let's talk a bit about going back a bit more to the institutional design and why this is a very dynamic system. I'll be giving a similar version of this talk for a group that is interested in protocols. So much more, protocol design and how do different feedback loops occur. And so this slide is really about that. And so, I'm going to talk a bit about what are all the different ways that information kind of flows through this system, and what are all the different points that people can actually give feedback and govern the system. I said earlier, I think a lot of people right now feel that technology is something that is being done to them, and they very rightfully reject that. But we can say, okay, well, what does technology look like that is deeply integrated into our lives and that actually we control? And so this is kind of getting into how that works. And so, going back to the sort of chore system, there is the definition of the chore, saying like, what is the actual task that needs to be done? Doing the dishes means everything in the sink goes into the dishwasher. Anything in the drying rack goes back onto the shelf. And if the dishwasher is empty, or the dishwasher is done, you take everything out, right? What does it mean to do the dishes? And we actually have to define, like, what is this unit of work mean? Because if everyone who does the dishes does it differently, if someone says, I'm just gonna, empty the sink, I'm just gonna empty the dishwasher, then it becomes hard to really make that a piece of work that can be independently valued. And that's kind of where the repetition aspect that I mentioned earlier is important, because if every task is totally unique every single time, then there's really no way to value it consistently. And so really saying like, these are the units of work that we think um, are worthy of a definition is an important part of the process. But also, it's not something that is set once forever. Anyone at any time can tweak a definition. So the idea is that everything about the system is always emergent and converging on, like, there's no truth, but a good enough for now sort of shared sense is important, right? Anyone at any time can say, I want to move the system a little bit more in this direction. And then over, many weeks or months, you end up getting an emergence of something that actually works pretty well for people. And if it ever is not working well, you can change it. And so having everything be very malleable and really emergent versus being very fixed and imposed is a really important part of making this work. So there's the chore definition. And then you kind of get, as I touched on, chore evaluation, chore priorities. Once you agree on the set of chores, you then have to decide, which ones are more important or less important, because there's only so much time we have. And so making relative trade-offs is the next piece of kind of creating the sort of emergent sense of like, this is the right balance. And so there's chores have values and people can update the valuation. And then the last thing is doing the chore performance, right? Now that we have defined the chore, it has been assigned some value, someone does the chore. And that's where the actual, maintenance of the physical space occurs and the production of social capital occurs. And then other people have to evaluate the performance. They say, okay, you did the dishes in a way that we think is appropriate, right? You did the job you said you did. We validate and accept your sort of claim. Or we say, actually, no, you didn't really do what you said you did. We have to make a tweak. And if that wasn't there, then people would just do whatever they wanted, and no one would trust. The system would lose legitimacy. And so all of these sort of this process and these loops are what allow this sort of technical system to maintain, what I'm going to say is embedded into the group versus something that is being, imposed upon them. So that's kind of that idea. But, so this sounds like hunky-dory, wow, structure, right? We love structure. Trust me, no one loves rules more than me. That's actually not true, but I know that I kind of give off that vibe sometimes. But it's not actually true. But It's not false either. I love institutions. Um, but I think we should recognize that if it was as simple as just making a bunch of rules, then we would have figured out society, 3,000 years ago. So obviously it's not. And we need to talk about why it's not so that we can have good expectations. And so James Scott, who is I think he's an historian. He teaches at Yale in like the School of Agriculture as a historian. He's written a lot of books about governance. One called "Seeing Like a State" is his most popular, and he writes a lot about how in the 20th century you had all these governments taking on these very ambitious, he calls them authoritarian, high modernist, like infrastructure projects that all failed. And he talks a lot about why. And his point was that formal order, in my case, this Chores app, is always and to some considerable degree parasitic on informal processes, right? They depend on relationships, sort of tacit knowledge, cultural know-how, which the formal system doesn't really model, which it depends on, and importantly, which it cannot create, right? The system cannot really produce the conditions that it requires to function. There has to be something else that is also there for a system to work, right? A system is not an end-to-end sort of solution. There's always more to it that the system cannot model. And if we forget that, then we're going to have a crisis. Seth Frey, who was a friend of mine, one of my collaborators on this project, a member of this community, he has this line. Seth is very funny. It's funny because we work together and we have a great relationship, but our views are actually a little bit divergent at this point. Like I think he's actually taken the attack very much against systems and more on just relationships. I don't want to mischaracterize his work, but I think that that's definitely something that he's more excited about. And kind of his line, he actually, there's a great photo of him in a t-shirt which says, this email could have been a meeting, which I just think is so funny. So that's kind of Seth's direction. But anyway, he has this line, which is community creates conflict, which creates community. The idea is that, don't trust systems to solve all of your problems. Trust that there's going to be conflicts when you live with other people, but it is solving those conflicts that actually creates the community that you want. And so we shouldn't run away. We shouldn't say structure is going to solve our conflict, because that's not real either, right? Like actually the conflict, the communicating with other people face to face is what's important. And don't let us think that systems are going to make that not necessary, which I totally agree with. Let the record show I'm here for it. But what I think, and this is kind of the line that I thought of last night, okay, how can we give the residual some leverage? What does that mean? So we look at all of this system I'm describing about doing the chores, this and that. I think that in my mind, it's okay. Let's create enough structure that the amount of stuff that has to be kind of figured out face to face is smaller, which I'm going to call the residual, right? So what is the residual amount of like non-modeled informal processes, right? Informal processes, the residual. How can we set things up such that residual is smaller and more manageable, right? I think that, I think systems can make that residual smaller. And then how can you also try to locate that residual such that when that is being resolved, it actually creates leverage in that many other systems benefit from it, right? So if you can take a huge 8-hour meeting, make it a 2-hour meeting, but let that 2-hour meeting actually benefit, 5 other things, then I think we're doing something interesting. But we're not saying that there is no need for informal process. It's that the informal process has been scoped down to something that is more manageable, and the sort of skill building that we're getting can have benefits in many other places. I think that is a realistic goal and one that I think is worth pursuing, because then it doesn't require heroic leadership to keep a group together. Almost anyone can develop capacity and then apply it in the context of their environment to do good. And so I think that is how I think about how we should respond to this very important critique about the limits of structure. So this is actually my last slide. So regenerative labor revisited. Just going back to the definition, repetitive low status work that maintains equilibrium, core to long-term function, but often undersupplied. Benefits are shared while costs are not. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, when visibly and evenly shared among members of the group, regenerative labor is in fact positive sum, not zero sum, positive sum. Not only is the physical space maintained, but relationships are strengthened as well. And then, because we're in the complex anarchist group, this creates the preconditions for bold, coordinated action beyond the shared space, right? By doing chores in our shared spaces, we actually build the social capital that we need to take action in the world together. So thank you. That is my talk. My name is Daniel Kronovet. You can email me at chrono@zeratan.world. There are a lot of links here for Zeratan. You can read our blog, which has a lot of. If you're like, wow, Daniel, how can I read a lot more of your stuff? I just really want to know more of your thing because you have a shtick and I'm into it. If you want more of this content, you can go to the blog. If you want to use Chore Wheel, you can go to this link. The QR code takes you to the Zeratan website. So yeah, any resources you want, it's all here. I'll leave this up for a minute so you can kind of like take a screenshot or whatever you want to do, and then we'll kick it over for questions. I guess we have about 20 minutes. Yeah, that took about 30 minutes. That wasn't too bad. So yeah, I'll put this up for another 10 seconds, and then I will end, and we can do Q&A.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Let's. I'll take this down, and then we're gonna.
Yeah.
All right. Also, I'll make these slides available to you. I'll post the link right now in the chat because that makes a lot of sense. Anyone with the link?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's post the link now. Okay. Here we go. Yeah. All right. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Thanks. It was super cool. I really enjoyed. Actually, they are like, yeah, basically now anyone is invited to chime in basically.
Also,
And I see there are
questions, so we can just go through those or.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So maybe we can start with those. I can see that Clem posted the question first, I think. Do you wanna discuss it?
Yeah. So
I'll mute to talk about it, Clem, or
she wrote in the chat that she's in a library and she can't talk.
Yeah. Okay. I can read the question. So
yeah, okay, cool.
The question about norms and accountability and excluding because of vibes. So what happens when someone has less capacity because they have paperwork to do, or they might, have some other limitation? How do we take this into account? Great question. So we've actually, so initially, it's so funny. I mean, going back to make systems working for more groups, I think that the more groups that use these tools, like every person has a new constraint, and it's been really interesting, I think, to think about how do we adapt this set of concepts to become more and more flexible without losing like the kind of unified vision that makes it useful. And that was abstract, but specifically, so when we started the project, there was everyone owes 100 points per month. That was the idea, was that there's a shared standard of 100 points and everyone owes it. And that's the shared expectation. And then there was a group that came on saying, actually, we have upstairs and downstairs. And downstairs kind of is their own thing, and they don't really contribute that much. But we want them to be part of the system. What do we do? And I said, you know what? Let's do this. When someone joins, the amount of points they owe can be variable. So some people owe 100, but someone else can owe 50. So you say, look, like when you join this group, you owe 50 points per month, or 20 points per month, or 100 points per month. And by doing that, you can say, okay, we're going to decide that what we expect from you is this based on your reasons. And that is what allows us to adapt to these different people's needs. So that's the intervention there, was, okay, you can just, depending on your needs, we'll decide at the beginning what kind of your expectation is, and that's just going to be that. All right, next question.
You can also explain if you want.
What was that? Let me just actually. Okay, next question.
I can also tell it if you want.
Yes, please.
So I had two questions. I think the first one you kind of already answered. Is like, but maybe not completely. It's like I think a digital space has like some friction of people getting into the digital space. Also, like, well, physical space, like the chores already happen in this a certain physical space. So is it possible to have some structure, some methods in the physical space which keeps more automatic trigger to do things?
Yeah, it's a good question. People ask me this a lot. I feel pretty strongly that the digital tools are essential. Just because I think so much of why any of this works is because you have a computer doing kind of the bookkeeping,
Mm.
right? I think thinking about all of the different kind of calculations, like, every hour the chores get more valuable because they haven't been done. Or, when one person says, I want to make the dishes be worth more points, that the fact that it automatically goes into effect, the fact that every vote is sort of done asynchronously. Every vote there's 72 hours. You just like open your phone, you do a thumbs up, thumbs down. None of that would be possible without a computer, right? I think that if you had an analog tool, then you would have a huge amount of bookkeeping that someone would need to do to maintain the system. And I think then it would very likely not succeed. So, if you read about, in the 1820s in the United States, there was a huge utopian socialist movement. Charles Fourier, Robert Owen. Like, this is a very famous kind of moment when they built these huge sort of like they called them phalansteries, the phalanx. Robert Owen made New Harmony, but there was a whole idea of this sort of you know pre-Marx sort of like early socialist utopian vision. And there's a great quote from some of the people during that time, which was, our days were spent in labor and our nights in legislation. It took so much time to just maintain all of these systems because all they had was pen and paper that they just didn't want to do it anymore. And so I think really relying on the computer, and this is kind of the Stafford Beer, the guy I mentioned, the cyberneticist, right? Like, I really don't think that this works without a computer, because so many of the tasks the computer does, someone else would have to do, whereas the computer does it for free. That said, I think that the idea of having maybe like a almost like one of those like like one of the like a screen that is maybe like one of those nice e-ink screens. Like, doesn't mean there can't be something in the physical space that has
Mhm.
a board. Like, you could have like a nice board that is one of those nice like e-ink screens, so it doesn't look like a bright screen that's a touch screen. You can like interact. Like, there's no reason why you can't interact with the digital system. There can't be a physical surface that is like in common space, like a big whiteboard that was digital that anyone could see. Like, there's no reason why you couldn't have that. I would love that. I mean, I haven't had that's not something I've been able to take on, but I think having some kind of physical screen or surface where the information is visible would help. I think that would be a really good thing to include. That has just been not something I've been able to look into. But I think that when we think about where does this end, when we have like more resources and more people, and this is the vision, I think someone working on that physical interface, I think would add a lot.
Yeah, I think it's
Oh
or
yeah, and so you had the second question also. What for individual tasks? Um, yeah, I think that going back to what is the world of things we're defining. I think we're only really talking about shared tasks. I think anything that's a physical task, it lives outside of the system because there's no benefit to structuring it. And so we're only really talking about shared tasks that are done by everyone in the group.
yeah, but like there are also like, for example, if everybody does their own dishes and then some people don't do their dishes, then it's like also a collective or like community problem. Or
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's actually a good point. Like, what happens if half the house never puts dishes in the sink and the other half leaves the dishes in the sink? So actually, I can tell you that does happen sometimes at Sage, and I would say there's kind of two ways to go about it. One, you say, you know what, we're actually going to not make this a chore at all. We're going to say we're not like everyone can't leave dishes in the sink, and that becomes a rule that you have to enforce in some other way. You say we're actually going to free up these points for other tasks. Dishes is not something that we're going to include because it's not people don't contribute evenly, and then you have to then do more work to enforce that norm. Or you could do, and this is something that also happens, say, okay, well, now This is kind of like the bad outcome is now people who otherwise would have done the dishes stop, because it's like, well, I'm not going to be the only one. And so what happens then is that now dishes as a chore it consumes more resources. And so resources that could have gone to other things are now being consumed by the dishes because more dishes work is being created. And I would say that's, I think that that's an interesting example because it really shows some of the complexity where, okay, if there's like uneven impact on the space, either you do more work to kind of establish norms so that the impact is lower, or you put in more resources to, clean that up within the system, but that takes resources away from other things. So that is actually a difficult outcome to solve because it's always wasteful. But it's not impossible to solve, but like you have to pay a price in either direction, which is interesting to sort of think about why.
I think this is one of the things as well where it kind of ties in further to Clem's point about different capacity. Also really, really interesting in terms of things like disability and parenting. I mean, one of the things I've noticed from having lived in a shared house previously while I had kids is there was myself and a couple of other parents, and a lot of our shared labor in a sort of subset of shared work and community was parenting. And then the people that weren't parents, some of them were also feeding labor into this and others weren't. And then there's a further interaction thing where obviously it's useful for us if somebody helps out with that labor. But to some extent, the work we were doing for parenting was helping out everyone else, because if there were just kids running around pooping everywhere, that's creating more work for them because they're like, oh shit, there's a poop in the hallway. So, but they didn't really see us changing the baby's nappy as preventing poop in the hallway. They just saw it as like our job.
Yeah.
So I think this might also be one of the places where we really, really run into the friction in terms of how much you need to achieve or can achieve via a system and how much you have via relationship, because to some extent you could systemize that. You could say, okay, Bob is too disabled to do his own dishes, but the rest of us aren't. So Bob's dishes is a communal task because Bob can't do them. But that requires either the system to explicitly already include the concept, people that say they can't do their dishes can't, or here's how we define who can't do their dishes, or just, again, like on a relational basis, like either of those concepts involve some amount of trust or acceptance. And if we're not careful, we really end up in a situation where you end up like the DWP, where you're trying to like micromanage who does or doesn't count as not able. But yeah, I find it really, in terms of like disability organizing and parent organizing especially, I think the concept of what counts as an individual task, sort of in inverted commas, is something you'd sort of have, I think, for this to work with justice with it, like for this to work justly, you'd actually need some kind of consent in the group about what does or doesn't count as individual in the first place. And that wouldn't necessarily always look, again, the same in every group. It would depend a lot on sort of the people in the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. I think two things that brings up for me. The first thing was, kind of the idea of the special case and the general case, right? The only reason why any of this works is because there's a sense of repetition that we can sort of use. And so in a more complex scenario where, there's so many tasks and they're all kind of unique and there's like these more complex relationships, then the special structure, it starts to look more like the general case, which is there's a lot of things that need to be done. No one task, there's really no structure that we can use to build a system. There's just, we have to have a different type of organization because we can't take advantage of the repetition to make a system that is sort of more automatic, right? And so there's a certain level of, as the system becomes more unique, there's less special structure that we can use as a handhold, right? That's number one. Number two, the idea of the residual, right? It sounds like in this case, there's a lot of special cases that don't quite fit into the regular system. And so how can we sort of get a sense of that? In this case, you could do something like, I could imagine, okay, well, there's going to be more high trust, it's going to be more relational. We'll use the system to an extent, but there's going to be a lot of special cases. And those special cases can't really be represented by the system. They have to be represented in our relationship. So there's going to be an understanding that this person doesn't do this task, or there's going to be an understanding that this is that and that is that. And so in this case, because it's a more complex situation, you could use the system as a foundation, but a lot of the like extra knowledge would need to live among the people. And like, okay, like you have to ask in that point.
I'm reminded of like tabletop role play gaming.
sure
or even
do.
with board games. Yeah, I'm reminded of that, where you get like house rules. You know,
Yeah.
you buy the game and lots of people buy the game because the game's published, you'll buy the game, but in individual groups, some people only use the rules because that's fine for them, and then other people, they're getting just as much value out of the game, but they're like, okay, well, we're not going to use these counters because, you know, it doesn't really work for the way we play. Like, it's sort of reminding me a bit of that.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think that that's really real. And I think that yes, I mean, you said it really well. Yes, I think that, you know, there's a system that has certain affordances, it does certain things. The more that you have, like, you know, the more that your needs are different than like the ideal case, the more you have to kind of maintain some sense of like house rules. But if you do that, you know, like you know, then it works. But yeah, I think yeah, it's, you know, no system is a total perfection. Every system exploits some kind of structure that if the structure isn't there, then the system can't really do anything. And yeah, that's kind of you. I think you really totally got it. Okay, let's see. Let's see what other questions we have.
Miss had the question, so maybe Miss can ask.
Oh yeah, please go for it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Hi. Great to meet you. Thank you for the talk. So my first question is about the I guess you have designed a system. It's super interesting. It definitely has some self-organizing incentives, and it allows people to communicate with each other. So this is really, really cool because it basically provides tools for self-organization. But one question that comes to mind now is how many people are in this system and how many people it supports before people begin to hack it in a way.
Yeah.
So my example for this would be distributed systems like blockchains, right? Where if you get 51% of the work or the maintenance of the system to be owned by one person, then bang, they now can abuse their power. So
Correct.
I mean, with the dishes, maybe not. Like maybe some people can just like get all of the dishes dirty and pile the sink to then increase the value of this. Like you can short the dishes, or like how do you stop this from happening in a way?
It's
thought
it's
about
such
that. Do you think this is necessary?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'm so glad you brought that up. So I spent many years in crypto before I did this project. And so I actually, you know, I was working on DAOs for years. And so I absorbed so much of that mechanism design caution. And so, you know, when we designed this, you know, every single mechanism we always thought about as like, how do you defend this? Like, is this incentive aligned? Can someone cheat the system? You know, because like we wanted to give individual people a lot of agency, right? We wanted individual people to be able to take actions unilaterally, but we had to ask, you know, how do we prevent someone from abusing the system? And I personally also asked, how do I prevent people from ganging up on a minority, right? I think being that like the person in the house who doesn't quite fit in, like I care very much about the person who doesn't fit in feeling safe at home and not feeling like I'm gonna get kicked out. Like I think when groups just like take someone who like is a little bit different and like kick them out, I find that very upsetting. It's like really like I'm like this whole movement, I don't want to be a part of this. These are not my people. These are not my values, right? I really get upset. And so I thought a lot of, you know, how do we both allow, you know, how do we keep the group, you know, the ideas live? How do we keep the system functioning so it doesn't just shut down when there's conflict, while also protecting the minorities, the sort of outliers from being abused, while also giving people individual agency as much as possible. These were kind of our goals. Some ways that we go about doing that. I think also one thing I'll say to your point, Miss, is I think that part of the reason why I was drawn to shared housing coming out of years in crypto is because I think part of the reason why crypto is so hard is because there's no accountability. It's very easy to exit, and so it's just so easy for an anonymous person. Like any way the system can be exploited, it will be. Whereas in shared housing, a lot of that really changes. There's already a sense of like a shared relationship layer, so it's not just a bunch of anonymous people. And so, you know, there's a sense of like we have a relationship that we can rely on. It's not just systems and rules. It's easy. It's hard to leave. You know, you can't just like hack and run. You know, like you have to see these people. And so I think the housing setting actually is a lot more favorable because like there's more relationships. People can't just be anonymous. You can't just leave. And also it's like easier to see if someone's cheating. Like if someone lies, it's hard to get away with things. And so I think because of those like new constraints, you actually get better outcomes in housing than you do in crypto. And I think, for example, with hearts, you can vote, like if someone does something really inappropriate, you can actually like have a vote to like take away a heart. So it's kind of like a strike system. And the way we did it, and this ended up not being that important because it never really happened, but it's something I thought about, all throughout this sort of Chore Wheel product, there's an idea of like an adaptive sort of consensus layer, or like adaptive thresholds where like every decision. So one idea was that I kind of wanted to get away with the idea of like majority rules or a quorum. So it's actually like every vote just happens, in the Slack. And it's not that you need to have like a quorum vote yes. It's every vote has a minimum number of upvotes. So for simple decisions, like for example, if you're going to spend shared funds, you need one upvote for every $50. So if you're spending $20 on something, then you just can do it yourself. It's like my one upvote, and if it's like one upvote, 0 downvotes, it passes. Right? So the idea is that anyone can almost unilaterally spend $20. If it's $60, now you need to have 2 upvotes. If it's 100, you need 3 upvotes. And the idea is that it's more like chemistry, activation, energy. Mm-hmm. It's less about like thumbs up, thumbs down. It's more like, are there enough people who care to even make this happen? And it turns out that that's actually a much, I don't want to say better, but I think that's a really nice reframe from we have to have a meeting, we have quorum, we have to like majority. Because I think it's more like.
It doesn't surprise me that this works actually. And I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the work on ants with flexible quorum threshold.
I'm not actually.
So there's these kinds of ants. I'll send you an email with it later. But just to introduce, basically when they emit pheromones in various amounts, right? Similar to how you have more or less likes to give, and also they can perceive the threshold of how much pheromone is emitted, right? So that kind of tells you how many people vote yes, right? However, the threshold that is turned into a decision changes and adapts depending on how urgent or serious the decision. So basically, let's say that someone sprayed poison in their nest. They have a nest that they're going to move to. They're voting to move to this nest. They're not going to wait for 90% to agree. They're going to just get going at 40% because they have no time because they're going to die. Yeah. But if they're just chilling in this nest and then they found a better one and they're trying to decide and they're like, oh, okay, let's wait for everyone to agree and then we go because there's no danger. So this kind of flexibility I've not really seen in much techno-social systems decision-making. And I think it could be actually really useful because it also models a lot how our brains work, right? Like fight or flight, you think with the limbic system, you respond immediately. Longer-term choices, meta decisions, emergent consequences, you take time to think about that. So I wonder if, so you might find that interesting. I'll send you an email. And the other thing you might find interesting is the work of Jeremy Pitt. So there's a paper called Digital Ocean by Scott and Pitt. Okay. And this is a open source, modular, federated, distributed system for communities to self-organize. And it does require like some developers in the community to change them if they want to change them, but there's also like a plethora of modules. So the idea is to address something like this and create digital polycentricity. So you might find that interesting. And I'll drop you an email and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'll tell you, I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you very much. Interesting stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, I will stop talking now to let other people.
Would you be up for copying me? And is there like a study on the ants, or is there like a paper or a study on these ants?
Yeah,
I'll put my email address in the chat. Would you be up for like
sending
it as well, or like tell me what to search for? Because I'm fascinated by this as well. Because this is definitely something I've run into. It's any sort of static vote kind of system. It's like it doesn't leave much space for the concept of contextual urgency, and this is really, really interesting, and I would really like to know more about that.
Gladly, and very happy to meet another interested person in the subject.
think
Cool.
it's gonna be also interested to probably there will be like to have it on the complex anarchism notion um, to so that can be shared with everyone like with the video.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. If you send me these things, anyway, pleasure to meet you all. This is like my
Yeah.
first meeting, so
Nice. Welcome.
Nice, thank you.
I'm happy to share some of my stuff. I did my PhD in self-organizing emergent systems, so I have a lot of scientific
Yeah, right on.
stuff, and I also have a home server and all of that. So I would like to help and to learn from all of you as well.
Cool. I mean, how are we doing on time? I thought you have a couple of questions, which I think are really, I kind of want to talk about, but also, we're a little past the hour. So do you want to give us give us our instructions for what we're doing next?
I mean, what I can say is there is no really no real rules. It's like mostly based on how people feel. If people want to stick around, let's stick around. If people want to leave, and if you have to leave, feel free to leave. Basically, I guess that's the idea.
I mean, I'm happy to stick around to like 15, then I kind of have to bounce and do some stuff. But yeah, I mean, do you want me to I can take your question and maybe we'll do one or two more. How does that sound?
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. Let's do that. Well, I mean, I have a lot of questions, so maybe I don't know, I don't want to monopolize the remaining time.
Well, I mean, let me take the ones you put in the chat, and then we'll see if anyone else has anything else. Okay.
Fair.
Right, so, yeah. So, giving the residual some leverage. I get the point in the abstract, but I have a hard time thinking of an example. Okay, so that's a great question. So I kind of just thought about this concept yesterday when I was like, there's I kind of talk about the limits of structure, but I need to have some kind of, well, what do we do about it? I can't just say this is all pointless. So I was like, okay, well, what's the answer? And that's kind of what I thought of. And I think, so here's an example, right? Here's an example that I thought of. So, we have the system, and that means that, instead of an 8-hour meeting, we can have a 2-hour meeting. So that's great. And now, okay, maybe what do we do with that extra 6 hours? And kind of my thought, and I thought this is maybe a little bit, idealistic, but what if people then took some of that time and played Settlers of Catan, right? What if you had instead of having a meeting to talk about budgets, you had a games night, a board game night. And by having that board game night, you actually developed skills around, making decisions inside of systems that then actually made everyone better at using the tools, right? The idea is by having a games night instead of a meeting, everyone actually got better at using the tools because they developed more skills around how do you sort of make decisions and think about resource management. And so, the board game night becomes a way to develop skills to actually use the systems better, right? That was kind of an example that I had, which I don't know if that really makes sense. Hopefully that made sense, but that's kind of the idea, right? You have this skill building activity, you have a games night, but then that has leverage because there's so many ways people can use that skill set of understanding how to play a game and make decisions and think about resources. That actually then has leverage because it means that everyone is now more able to make real decisions using the tools that they have. So that's the idea of leverage. Again, I'm still developing the idea, but hopefully that kind of got at what I was trying to say. So there's that. Your next question, credit score creeped out by it. That is a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up. It's something that I think about all the time. I think a lot about reputation systems. I think a lot about how they're deployed and what they mean. There's that great episode of Black Mirror called Nosedive that people love to talk about, where this woman, everyone has a social credit score and she has this whole crisis because she wants to be popular. And yeah, it's really real. It's really dark. I think that the answer or one part of an answer is I think kind of in the abstract, I think that when we're dealing with any kind of reputation system, I think the more concrete it is, the better versus the more general. I think if you have this is my human score, which is a number that represents my entire worth as a human being, that is almost certainly going to be horrible. But I think the more specific it can be, this is my chess ELO score, this is just how good I am at chess, that's a very specific thing, then I think it's much easier for it to be legitimate. And so I think the more that we can, the most specific we can be, the better. I think any reputation system should be as specific as possible about what it actually means, and not try to be some kind of abstract measure of someone's value. I think that's step one. I think step two, making it feel legitimate and that people have clarity about what things increase or decrease the value, right? I think the more that there is a lot of clarity about exactly what is happening and why, the more that the results feel legitimate to people and don't feel like it's something that is being imposed on them. So I think having the score be as concrete as possible, having the mechanisms be as clear as possible, I think are two ways of making something that is seen as legitimate and not coercive. So yeah, I think that's the answer. Some people struggle with it, to be honest. I think some people would just rather like just have no structure. But I have a hard time communicating with those people. And yeah, I think it's all well and good till something bad happens, right? I think that in my mind, in the situation where people say we don't want structure, we just want everything to be vibes, and then the vibes are off, and then the house falls apart. And so I think for me, I care a lot about how do we recover from rupture. And I think that sometimes with these systems, like, yes, I think in the moment we would rather have no system, but then the rupture becomes like an existential event. Whereas if we have structure, even if that is limiting, it feels limiting, it actually gives us the ability to recover from conflict. And so those are my thoughts on that. It's not a great answer because I think that there is definitely something lost, as you identified, but I think that approached with some care and thoughtfulness, it's net positive. That's my position. Some people really disagree with me. Okay, next question. Scaling up. Yeah, scaling up. I think that some of these principles I think could be applied to a lot more tools. I'm pretty focused on the shared space just because I think that as to Mrs. point, there are a lot of constraints. Like everyone knows each other. They spend a lot of time together. It's difficult to leave. And also people can see what's happening in the house is all really important to making the system work. And so I think as we scale up, those constraints get weakened, which just means that the system has become more sophisticated. So I'd say right now, given that I'm still figuring all of this out, the housing setting has the most favorable constraints. And so that's kind of where I'm focusing. And I think as things scale up, which I think the principles, the basic idea definitely could, but we have to be very aware of how some of the constraints that are helping the system succeed are going to be weakened, and how do we respond to that? So I think that's kind of my thought about that. Yeah, I think that's kind of my thought about that. So yeah, I just answered all of your questions. I know that took like 5 minutes, but yeah, you feel free to respond, or anyone else feel free to jump in.
No, I mean, I'll leave other people maybe jump in if they want to, but you did answer the questions. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Yeah, maybe one or two more. Maybe one more question. Everyone's ready for their summer evening. So yeah, I guess
Well, actually, wait. I think there was a question. I don't know if we answered it, but Clem said, in case no other question, and maybe that was covered earlier because my connection broke. But in case not, the question was, I'm very interested in the conflict trades community part, and would be curious whether this has really been your experience. In my former flat share, conflict did not really lead to more community or problem solving. Granted, we didn't have a digital tool to organize.
Great question. Yeah, so I think that's kind of where I said Seth and I have sometimes we go in different directions. So I think the idea that you just people fight and they like make up. I think that to your point is like, yes, sometimes. I think that's true sometimes. I think anytime there's a rupture, and this kind of goes back to giving the residuals some leverage. Like when there's a rupture, like people don't always make up. People do sometimes, but I would say it's actually more rare for people to make up after a conflict than to just end the relationship. I think that in our lives, we can experience both, right? Sometimes you have a friend, you have a conflict, and you make up and your relationship is stronger. Are there times you have a conflict and you're just like, I don't want to talk to that person anymore? I think we'd be probably happier overall if we resolved our conflicts. But I think a lot of people, we could say, oh, our generation is just bad at communicating, which I think is like maybe kind of an easy answer. And yes, I think a lot of people just say, you know what, I'm done with that person, right? And so yeah, I think I think that to say, conflict makes people stronger can be true. I think to your point, like it's not always true. And I think to just take that as an assumption and say we don't have to have systems because people just make up, I think is clearly not the path I've chosen. Yeah, so I think yes, I think that it can be true. And I think that conflict is an important part of building, you think about a long-term romantic relationship, right? It's like, yes, you fight and you make up, and that's part of what makes it deep, but also very few of your relationships have that depth. So yeah, I think yes, I think there's a time. I think integrating conflict is important. There's that whole like forming, storming, norming, performing idea of team formation. Like all that is true, but I think people are also very quick to run away from conflict, and so I think yeah, like I don't want to. I think there's enough conflict already. Like let's try to eliminate as much as we can, and like the fear that in a totally frictionless society where everything is easy at our fingertips, no one's going to ever have to learn how to relate to anyone else anymore, is I think also a real thing to think about. Yeah, I think that's also a real thing to think about. So yeah, I think there's not a single answer. I think there's a lot of layers to it. But yeah, I think to your point, conflict does not inherently create community. I think that that's a little bit of a idealistic expectation.
Yeah, thanks. And it makes me think that I feel like it's just a whole other dimension that requires its own kind of work, right? Like we just need to learn the skills to do like managing conflicts, and to like manage them in a way that makes our organizations or households better. I feel like you just can't address it with like a score system. This is a job that has to be. This is, I guess, the kind of job that is more resistant to like getting done by digital tools, right?
Yeah,
It's something that just is hard to take away from the informal part, I guess.
I agree. But one thing I would say, I think that like just like with any kind of physical stress, I think that there's a certain amount of stress that the body can recover from, and a certain kind that is damaging, right? So, can we say, okay, instead of having a huge conflict, like going back to kicking someone out, right? Instead of a huge conflict that we have to kick someone out and now it's a whole drama and everyone's upset, can you create structure so that actually now it's just, we have to have a conversation in a structured way. And all of a sudden now, instead of it being a huge rupture that is devastating, it becomes a tiny rupture that we can repair from, right? Just like you think about any kind of strength training or athletics, there's a certain amount of stress that is good for the body, and too much stress is bad for the body. And so, how can we set up systems such that the actual conflict is manageable and not overwhelming versus it being overwhelming? I think that's a productive way to think about it.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Chris.
Okay.
Should we kind of wrap it up? I feel like it's maybe time for everyone to go about their evenings.
Yeah, I think it's time. There was a message by Axel, but it is getting late. Yeah. So up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll post the blog in. So I write a lot about this. Feel free to like take a look, and that's kind of where a lot of my stuff is going. So that's kind of where I'm going to keep writing. So yeah, take a look at that. That's where all my stuff is going these days.
Thanks a lot. All right. Sorry, go on, Chris.
Hey, I just wanted to chip in. So there are some new faces. I was wondering if we have some way to like onboard them. Does anybody know? I know we have a Proton email that you guys can email us at. And then maybe we can like talk about, for example, for me, like how to use the Notion and how to, orient yourself to the Complex Anarchist group more than, just this talk, but for future talks and stuff like this. Does somebody have something to chip in here?
I mean, I would suggest that people that we don't have their contact, if they want to leave it here, well, that would be great. I mean, I am in contact with Miss, and I think that someone else dropped their mail, but that was for another reason. But I guess basically leave the mail here if you wanna keep in touch. Do you think this is sensible? Yeah.
I mean, now that you provided the centralized mailing list, right? We just write to that, and I guess we see, right? I have already emailed the people who have given me emails. Hope you got it.
Thanks.
And I got the Notion invite. So
Awesome.
if you have a page about house rules and all of that in the Notion, I'll find it.
Yeah, cool. We'll just sort you out afterwards. And yes, the Notion is a digital tool. It's a website that you can use like asynchronously to like work together, and we've been using it in our Complex Anarchism network to kind of keep a trace of whatever we're doing and stuff like that. But we can give more detailed updates about all the descriptions about all of that. Maybe outside this meeting. But yeah, I guess that's all for now. It was really cool to have you all. I really loved the tool and ideas. So if anyone wants to like mention one last thing, feel free to do it now. But otherwise, I guess we all have a lot of heat to enjoy left today, or to suffer.
Well, thank you very much, and pleasure to meet you all.
Right,
Enjoy your suffering.
All right, everyone. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel.
Of course, anytime.